Welcome to the Church and Culture Podcast, a weekly discussion with Dr. James Emery White on the latest trends happening in culture and where and how the church should respond. Jim is the founding and senior pastor of Mecklenburg Community Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, president of Serious Times, a ministry devoted to exploring the intersection of faith and culture, former professor of theology and culture at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where he also served as their fourth president, and the author of more than 20 books. I am your host, Alexis Dry, and I can't wait to dive into this week's conversation. All right, thanks for joining us. We've had more than a handful of conversations on the podcast at this point about the decline of Christianity in America and the many reasons for that, and we'll be sure to link some of those conversations in the show notes. Now, one of the results of that decline has been a dramatic close in churches. Whereas in the 1940s, nearly 85% of Americans claimed they belonged to a church, now that number is less than 50%. And those who claim to attend a church at least once a week are more in like the 30% chance or 30% range. In 2019, even before the COVID pandemic, America was losing about 1,000 churches a year, outpacing the number of new churches that were established. Now, experts are predicting that 100,000 churches will be closed before 2050. What we want to explore today is what happens when a church closes. But first, Jim, you and I recently read an article that reported the findings of a Lifeway research study that was conducted last fall. Can you tell our listeners a little bit more about that?
Yeah, before I do, the stats are actually worse than you stated. At least based on one source I was reading, the Center for Analytics, Research, and Data estimates that between 3,850 up to 7,700 houses of worship will close every year in the United States alone. So up to one estimate is up to almost 8,000 a year in the U.S. alone. That's between between 75 and 150 congregations every week. It is a stunning thing to think about. But to the Lifeway research, it was interesting. It found that most pastors do not expect their church to close in the next 10 years. When asked if they felt their church would be around for at least another decade, 94% agreed. And that did not surprise me. I mean, I think most pastors traffic in hope and in faith. And I think that up until a church's last day, they're probably still hoping that it won't close and doing everything they can to keep it. So it would take a pretty dire situation and I think a heavily challenged and weakened faith to say, yeah, I don't think my church is going to make it past another decade. The wake-up call, though, that they aren't being Pollyanna, and the wake-up call that they really do have a sense that maybe things might not be great, is that they said that 94% agreed that they felt their church would still be around in 10 years, but they didn't check strongly agree. When you read that survey further down, that was to me the real headline. Fewer than 4 in 5 strongly agreed that their church would be around in 10 years. So yeah, I would call that having a brave face, but also, you're reading some tea leaves there. And it wasn't surprising to me, too. Another little thing that was in that particular survey was that it was small church pastors that were having the most anxiety. Those leading churches with fewer than 50 in attendance were the least likely to agree that their church would still be around in 10 years. And, you're right. You add into that more churches are closing that are being planted. There was another Lifeway survey. This crossed like 35 different denominations and groups that found that around, I think it's 3,000 are planted every year, but 4,500 close. I think that's in the SBC or something like that. That was across a select 30 denominations. So we're not planting as fast enough to even keep up with the closings.
Well, thankfully, the church that you planted more than 30 years ago is indeed still going strong, but you have had a front row seat to a lot of church closures. What is it that ultimately, and not that there's one thing, but what is it that ultimately causes a pastor or a congregation to close the doors of its church?
Yeah, it's always necessity. It's necessity. I've never seen a church closed because it wanted to. It always closed because it had to. Very, very rarely because it wanted to. And money is probably the biggest driving factor. Even a small church can hang around a fairly long time if its building is paid for, but even that will catch up. It can only go on for so long because you just have raw maintenance costs and insurance costs and utility costs. Um, Estimates are that for a typical church, about $7 to $10 a square foot annually just on those kinds of things, upkeep. So even if you own your building, you're still spending a lot of money on it. But most churches, even if they do own their own facility, can struggle having the money to like field a pastor, and certainly one who is full time. Another dynamic for closings that you read about a lot that you don't read about a lot. It's because it's like a dirty little secret, but I'll expose it because I get mad about it. And that's churches have the area surrounding them change ethnically, and they refuse to reach out. I think we just need to call that what it is. It's racist, or whatever it is. It's dark. It really is dark. But let me unpack that a little more fairly. When an area surrounding a church, one that the church had historically served, changes, and that can happen, and the church doesn't change with it or do what it takes to reach that new demographic. For example, you say like an area that was predominantly white becomes predominantly Hispanic or something like that. Or the area gentrifies and becomes a lot younger, and that church was just very oriented toward an older demographic, an older congregation with certain musical tastes or styles. Any number of scenarios like that, where the thing around the church changes, the church does not change. It refuses to change. It's a choice. It is a choice that church is making. It can change its outreach and its ministries and worship styles to better reach their mission field, or simply dwindle in numbers and eventually close. And let's just be honest, many just refuse to change. I know of one church particularly comes to mind very quickly to me, that has a huge campus and building complex. It ran in the thousands during the 1950s and 60s, and I think even into the 70s. They are situated in an area that when they were having that growth, it was largely white, blue collar, and middle class. Over time, the area changed dramatically. Just really did change. It was significant. They could have started all kinds of ministries, including a Spanish-speaking service that would have enabled them to keep reaching the people around them. They refused, which is tragic. Now most of their campus is shuttered. It's in disrepair. They've got deferred maintenance that they would never be able to attend to. I don't think they have more than 100 or so in attendance, down from thousands. Now they got maybe 100, 200 max in attendance. But see, that was a choice that they made. I think it was a wrong choice, and I think sometimes it can even be a sinful choice. But there's so many things you can do. Even if they said, well, we don't feel like we're best able to reach this new demographic. Okay, move. Go. Plant a different church. Let somebody else come in and have this church that can, and you go somewhere else or get behind another church plant. I mean, you can do things if you have a towel over your arm and a kingdom mindset. But to just sit there and say, we will not do anything to reach the people around us, literally saying like they just couldn't go to hell, and we're just going to keep our little way of doing church with the people that we like and that are like us until we die, and the church dies with us. I just don't think that's very missional. I don't think that reflects the heart of Jesus. But so I think that's something. Another reason why some churches close is another dark little thing is they split. They just got angry and mad about something and split, and church died. And but sometimes the ending of a church, like a new church plant or something, it happens. It just wasn't able to get off the ground. It's kind of like, a rocket has to have a certain amount of fuel to break gravity. And it really is hard to get a church past a certain critical mass where it is surviving and thriving after the 3, 4, 5 year mark, which is why so many church starts don't last 5 years. That's the critical, that first 24 months particularly is just critical. I remember many years ago, I was being present. I was God. I really do feel God led me to be present for the death of a church, and it stayed with me. And it led me to do a season of pretty heavy conferencing to try to help church planters as a result during that time. But I was on my summer study break, and that year I wanted to be sure to visit a church that had been planted about 15 months earlier by a guy that had come to Mac, visited Mac, had based a lot of his strategy on what we were doing. We were still a church plant ourselves. We were only about 3 years old at the time, but by God's grace, doing well, and was beginning to kind of try to mentor and help other church plants. Because we were still meeting in a school, and there's a lot you could learn from us then as a fellow church plant. But he launched out, and after his first Sunday, he called me, and they had something like 140 people. Just a great start, more than we had when Met got started. It was great. He called a couple of more times after that with some questions on various things, and everything seemed to be going well. And then I didn't hear from him for a while. I just assumed he was just up and running and having a blast. And so when we happened to be in the area where he had planted, I wanted to make that one of the churches that we dropped in on, and just to see how things were going. I called the number for the church. This was pre-internet, so there was no website to go to. And I got a recording giving me the information that I needed and the directions to the movie theater that they had been meeting in. And we went. When he pulled into the parking lot, we were one of like maybe 5 or 6 cars. That was it. We thought we'd gotten the times for the services wrong. Maybe we'd come early or we're coming late. And so we didn't know. We went in, found out the service times were right. We were right. We were just one of only about 13 people present for the service. I mean, this was a church that started out with well over 100. And the pastor spotted us when we walked in, which wasn't hard to do. And I remember what he said to me when he saw me. I said, of all the days for you to walk through the door, of all the days, I just can't believe you're here. And I thought, what in the world is going on? And I found out it wasn't just that the church hadn't been going well. On that day, his message was announcing the end of the church, that they were ending the public services of the church. They were going to become a small group Bible study in his home until they could get placed. The church was finished. And in his message that day, he talked about why they were having to do this and what the future might hold down the road. He confessed to some leadership misjudgments, a lack of core development, some assimilation struggles. He was very honest. He was very transparent, very humble. But in the end, the bottom line was that the church had died. And I walked away stunned. I could hardly look the guy in the eye. I felt so sorry for him and so sorry for the church and sorry for the hopes and dreams that had passed away on that day. I know what is burning in the heart of a church planter. And I couldn't even hardly go there emotionally with what he must have been dealing with. And I kept thinking, gosh, how would I feel if I were this guy? I would be throwing up in a corner. And how do you look your spouse, your children in the eye? May the bungee jump with you. I was devastated for him. And what was sobering was that even from that one service that I was at, it was obvious they were doing a lot of things right. They had, impressive graphics and printing. And I remember the music was, it was good music. He was a good communicator. I mean, I didn't sit there and listen to him and say, oh, no wonder it died. I mean, you didn't feel that way at all. The location was good. It was a fast-growing area of town. Just about everything was in place, and he was doing all the things that most church planters know to do, and it died. And I remember, I've read that almost about 80% of all church plants fail. I don't know if that's true, but I wouldn't be surprised, particularly if you spread that out to where, it's the first 5 years, 80% don't make it past 5. So there's all kinds of reasons why a church can pass and close, and yeah.
I want to circle back to how that pastor might have been feeling, but let me get a couple of other questions to you first. When a church closes, like with not if it's renting space from someone else, but if a church that owns its building closes, what tends to happen to that actual church building?
Yeah. Well, it's limited really only by creativity, but I've seen 3 or 4 things that tend to happen in the wake of that. One is that it's just simply sold to another church, or it merges with another larger church that needs a building. That's not uncommon. Second result that can happen is that it's sold. The property in the building is sold and is completely repurposed. I think I've seen more old churches turned into restaurants in the last 3 years than I have my entire life. It's almost like this really cool vibe. They like to keep the stained glass and the woodwork, and it's just becomes a really nice restaurant or brewery. And it's just sold and repurposed that way. A third trend is for a church to take it over. Like, in other words, it's not sold to another church, but it's taken over by a church that is multi-site, and they use that particular church as one of its sites. And then the last one that I've seen that I think a lot of people would like to see have it happen more is also is that it's turned into affordable housing. It's made into apartments or condos or some type of affordable housing. The land itself is. The building often has to be raised, but the proceeds from that can all go toward something like that. But it just depends. It just those are some of the ways that I've seen it done. Probably most commonly is one of those 4.
Mhm. What about the people, the pastor who led it, the people who attended? Does the end of that church simply propel them to seek a different one, or does it tend to serve as the end of someone's own faith journey?
Yeah, not very often it doesn't do that. People who the last standing people of a church before it dies tended to be the most faithful, the most committed, the most tear stained at its end. They're demoralized, but they do tend to find another church home. The pastor is demoralized if they had one, a vocational one at the end. Most of them don't by that stage. They're not able to afford or pay for someone to be in full-time vocational work. So the pastor probably had already left, trying to find another place to serve. But if not, that's what they're trying to do, is just get another job somewhere. But I really don't see the faith, though, of either the leader or the people destroyed. Just disappointment, discouragement, sadness, and a real nostalgia for what the church had been like, the days when it was growing and reaching people. And remember when we built this building, and remembering, just fondly the life change that was there. It's not just when a church, it's not just a building. We talked about this recently, you and I think about just how it's a sacred space. It's special, and I think that like even people now when they come to MEC and this place, and they met Christ here, there's a sacredness to this place. There's a holiness to it. There are milestones here. They remember when either they became a Christian here, or their child became a Christian, or when they got baptized, or someone was dedicated, or just, there's so many different things that a building can mean, particularly when it's a church. So the sentimentality is strong.
I'm wondering, too, about the effect that a church closure may have for even those who didn't attend that church. Because church buildings are often multi-use. Many host, AA meetings or Boy and Girl Scout troop meetings, community pantries, and so on. What impact does a church closure have on its local community?
It's interesting. I was just when we were going to be, you wanted to talk about this, but prior to even that, I had just read an article before I got your email on this about something about that was happening in Nashville. There's a story playing out there about a church closing and what impact it has on that area and what it's going to mean if it does close. And all of that was being talked about, just like your question. And the reason it got press is because there was a bit of a fight between like one group that just wants to sell it and make millions because it's in a very high-end place. I think their parking alone generates tens of thousands of dollars a month because of where it's located downtown near what we used to call Music Row. Now they call it the District, I think. But people want to sell it, and people who want to keep it as a church because of its impact on the community. And the person involved who wants to keep it as a church is Amy Grant, because her great grandfather started it. The Christian musician and singer Amy Grant. It was the Nashville Church of Christ. And so they're trying to save it and have it still do good to the community, and others are wanting to sell it and move on. But it's worth millions. But anyway, what it does to a community is really stunning. I was doing not for this, but for something else. Was looking at the community impact of a church, of a typical older church. You ready for this? It contributes $1.7 million annually in what's considered community economic impact. The average older church, $1.7 million annually in terms of community economic impact, whether it's daycares, educational programs, social services, food kitchen. There's just so many things that churches do that really make a difference. And so the loss to a community is huge. Because, for example, that church in Nashville, what Amy Grant was saying is like, look, I just don't want to see this torn down, and not only because of my great grandfather's legacy, but just the loss of a church for this area is huge, because it's not only does it tell people about Jesus, but it offers food and education and daycare and housing. And I think they had a free library and so many things that were important to the community that's lost. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people forget. Sometimes you'll hear somebody make a snarky remark about how churches are tax exempt, have tax-free status, as if like, oh, they're just getting free money and we need that money for tax rolls. They have no idea what impact a church does for their community. If the churches were gone, or all that would go out of business and would have to close if they didn't have that tax exempt status, if they had to pay taxes on that property, what the community would lose. I mean, who's thinking that even a smaller, older church is making $1.7 million a year annual contribution? That's a heck of a lot more than they would ever pay in taxes. And so you need to be thinking about just what churches do that really fly under the radar and make a huge difference in terms of I just even look at all that MEC does, not just, as a church that we're able to do because we're not having to spend money on taxes. We're able to do a heck of a lot more for the poor, as well as, and that's significant.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned a handful of times already, like using words like demoralizing, like how difficult emotionally it can be when a church closes. With the exception of things like, moral failing or illegal practices that may, be behind a church closure, I wonder if some may just find themselves dumbfounded by their church's lack of success, like a spiritual component to this. Like maybe they're even asking God, like, why? Why would you let a church that was trying to worship you, trying to tell others about you, why would you let us close? Yeah. I can imagine you've probably had conversations like this before. What do you think?
Oh, I have, and it's I've never met a more broken person than a pastor of a church that failed, or the pastor of a church that died, or a church planter that had a church just never take off, and eventually they just had to close. I'm so often struck, Lex, by their humility, their abiding faith, but they are shells of who they once were. They are tired. They are discouraged. They are spent. And they're good people. They're such good people. One of the things that I tend to walk away from with these conversations is, man, their faith is stronger than mine. Their prayer life is more robust than mine. Their commitment to the cause burns brighter. I mean, and this is what happened. And I can almost feel guilty, because they're just, gosh, you just are better pastor than I am. I can feel that way. So it's really not about one person being better or more spiritual than another, because I walked away feeling like they are far superior to me. I do believe, though, that many are set up for failure. And I hate that. I really do. They're severely underfunded, and they either weren't able to raise sufficient capital, or their denomination or agency didn't give them what they needed, just set them almost up for failure, or they didn't have the right gift mix for leading or teaching a church. And that's fine. That one gift is not better than another, but it's wrong to turn somebody loose or falsely encourage someone to do something as high stakes as planting a church when they don't have the spiritual gift mix for it. But mostly what I do, to go back to your question, I'm so babbling there, I just try to encourage them and listen and sympathize, because I get it. And in fact, we're recording this the week after Easter. And I brought this with me, knowing we were going to talk about churches closing. And I always release the same blog. I don't know how many people listening follow me on social or subscribe to the blog. It's free, but twice a week, every Monday and Thursday, I have a blog post. And I always release the same blog the Monday after Easter. And the reason is because the first year that I wrote it and released it, the response was so overwhelming. It just became an annual thing. And it was for pastors and church leaders who come off of Easter Sunday feeling really discouraged. And every year I receive emails from pastors, I already have this year, saying in one form or another that they are leading a plateaued or declining church under 100 people. Its days are numbered. We're probably going to have to close. But then they say, but thank you for the blog, because what you wrote helped me sort out some things. So I'm going to read it. I figured that was, because I in the hopes and prayers that it will open some minds to some people, but also encourage some as well. So I'm just going to read that blog, if that's okay. Mm-hmm. This is a blog with a very specific audience. I know it may exclude some of you, but it may be healthy for you to eavesdrop. This is for all the church planters and their volunteers on post-Easter Monday struggling to make it from week to week, and for the leaders and members of established churches that are anything but mega, well below the 200 threshold in terms of average attendance. I don't know how Easter Sunday went for you, but I have a hunch. May have been bigger than normal, but less than breakthrough. Good, but not great. Your attendance was larger, but not staggering. You want to be happy about it, but you're not writing home about it. You're grateful to God, but now that Easter is over, there's a letdown. You wanted so much more. It was, in the end, a typical Easter Sunday, and you are normal. When you lead a church, you can't help but dream, and dream big. I think that's one of the marks of a leader. But for most, it's not long before the dream comes face to face with reality. When I planted Mecklenburg Community Church, I just knew that the mailer I sent out, we started churches with mailers those days, would break every record of response, that we would be a church in the hundreds, if not already approaching 1,000 in a matter of weeks or months. The reality was starting in a Hilton hotel in the midst of a tropical storm with 112 dripping wet people. And by the third weekend, through the strength of my preaching, cutting that sucker in half to a mere 56. Actually, not even 56, because our total attendance was 56. That means there were 15, maybe 20 kids, so maybe 30 or so people actually sitting in the auditorium. As a good church planter, I think we also counted people who walked slowly past the hotel ballroom doors in the hallway. Yes, we've grown over the years, but that's the point. It's taken years. It usually does. I know the soup of the day is rapid growth, but please don't benchmark yourself against that. It's not typical. It's not even usually healthy. So stop playing that dark, awful game called comparison. It is sick and terribly toxic. I don't care who you are, there will always be someone bigger or faster growing. So why torment yourself? Or worse, fall prey to the sins of envy and competition as if you are benchmarked against other churches. Rumor has it the true competition is a deeply fallen secular culture that is held in the grip of the evil one. The truth is that on the front end, every church is a field of dreams. After a few months or a year or two, it morphs from a field of dreams to a field to be worked. And your field may not turn out as much fruit, much less as fast as you had hoped. That's okay. You can rest assured that it probably has little to do with your commitment, your faith, your spirituality, your call, or God's love for you. I know it's frustrating. We've got a lot of the world in us, and thus we look to worldly marks of success and affirmation. But what matters is whether you are being faithful, not whether you are being successful. You're not in this for human affirmation, but a well done from God at the end. Did you preach the gospel yesterday? Then well done. Did you and your team do the best you could with what you had? Then well done. Did you and your church invite your unchurched friends to attend? Then well done. Did you pray on the front end and have faith and trust? Then well done. Ignore the mega churches that tweet, blog, and boast about their thousands in attendance. Yep, even mine. It's not that we don't matter. We do. And we're very proud of the hard work of our volunteers and the lives we have the privilege of changing. There's a place for us. It's just that you matter too. And you may need to remember that. And perhaps most of all, on the Monday after Easter.
I think that's a great way to close. Thank you, Jim. Thank you guys for listening. We hope you'll tune in next week.